Have you ever heard of a saint whose body remains incorrupt and from whom flows a mysterious oil that has healed thousands? In the mountains of Lebanon lived a monk whose extraordinary holiness transcended borders and religious confessions. Saint Charbel, the hermit of Lebanon, lived in silence and austerity, but after his death, God glorified him with miracles that continue to this day, attracting pilgrims from all over the world. His figure represents a bridge between East and West, a testament to holiness in the Eastern tradition of the Church, and a powerful intercessor for all who come to him in their needs. Chapter 1. Childhood and Youth in the Lebanese Mountains. Yusef Antoun Makhlouf, who would later be known as Charbel, was born on May 8, 1828, in the small mountain village of Beka Kafra in northern Lebanon. This region, marked by the majesty of the Lebanon mountains and by a Christian tradition dating back to the earliest centuries of the Church, forged the character of the future saint. His parents, Antoun Zarour Makhlouf and Brigitte Chidiac, were humble Maronite farmers who lived their faith with simplicity and depth amidst a predominantly Muslim society where the Christian community was a persevering minority in its adherence to Christ and the Church. The premature death of his father, when Yusef was only 3 years old, profoundly marked his childhood. Antoun, who worked transporting crops with his mules, died after being forced to work for the Turkish army, which then dominated the region. This circumstance plunged the family into poverty, but strengthened their spirit of sacrifice and trust in divine providence. His mother, Brigitte, a woman of extraordinary piety, was responsible for transmitting to her children a robust faith and a special devotion to the Blessed Virgin Mary, so characteristic of Maronite spirituality. Years later, she would remarry a pious man who, understanding Yusef's religious vocation, would facilitate his path to the monastery. From his earliest childhood, Yusef showed a natural inclination towards prayer and solitude. While tending the small family flock on the mountain slopes, he spent long hours in contemplation, admiring creation as a reflection of divine beauty. The villagers remember how the young boy would often withdraw to pray, seeking solitary places where he could dedicate himself to meditation without being disturbed. This tendency towards the inner life, however, did not prevent him from diligently fulfilling his family responsibilities, standing out for his obedience and industriousness. Yusef's formal education was very limited, as was common among the farmers of the Lebanese mountains of that time. However, he received a solid religious formation from the village priest, who taught him basic prayers, the rudiments of the Maronite liturgy, and the fundamental principles of the Catholic faith. In the small stone church of Beka Kafra, young Yusef became familiar with the beautiful rites of the Syriac tradition, the chants in Aramaic, the language spoken by Jesus, and the profound prayers of the Eastern liturgy, elements that would nourish his spirituality throughout his life. The decisive moment of his youth came when, at the age of 23, he clearly felt the call to consecrate his life entirely to God. One night, while praying before a small icon of the Virgin Mary that was venerated in his home, Yusef experienced a profound inner certainty. God was calling him to monastic life. With unwavering determination, he decided to answer this vocation, despite the initial incomprehension of some family members who saw him as the future support of the family. His mother, however, with the wisdom of women of faith, understood that her son belonged to God before her and gave him her blessing to follow the path to which the Lord was calling him. Chapter 2. The monastic vocation in 1851. Yusef left his native village to enter the monastery of Our Lady of Mayfouk, belonging to the Lebanese Maronite order. His departure was simple, without great farewells. already reflecting the detachment from earthly affections that would characterize his entire life, carrying only the essentials. The young man walked the steep paths of the Lebanon mountains, leaving behind not only his physical home, but also all worldly expectations and projects, to dedicate himself completely to the search for God in the silence of the cloister. After a brief period in Mayfouk, Youssef was sent to the monastery of Saint-Maron in Anaya, where he would begin his novitiate. There he received the monastic habit and the religious name of Charbel, in honor of a 2nd century Antiochian martyr. This change of name symbolized his death to the world and the beginning of a new life consecrated entirely to Christ. During his novitiate, Brother Charbel stood out for his exact observance of the monastic rule, his spirit of obedience, and his love of silence. The testimonies of his companions agree in pointing out that, from the beginning, something extraordinary was perceived in him, a luminous presence that radiated peace and recollection, even in the midst of the most ordinary tasks. The young novice dedicated himself with fervor to the intense prayer life that characterizes Maronite monks, the daily celebration of the divine liturgy, the recitation of the 7 daily offices according to the Syriac tradition, and long hours of personal prayer. This immersion in the liturgy, with its profound symbolism and theological richness, decisively shaped his spirituality. Particularly significant in the Maronite tradition is the devotion to the Holy Cross, a central element in the spiritual life of Brother Charbel, who constantly contemplated the mystery of Christ's passion as a source of salvation and a path to configuration with the crucified Lord. After completing his novitiate and making his monastic vows, Brother Charbel was sent to the monastery of Fifan to pursue theological studies that would prepare him for the priesthood. There he had the blessing of being a disciple of another great Maronite saint, Ni'matullah Kasab al-Hardini, canonized in 2004, who exerted a decisive influence on his spiritual formation. From Father Ni'matullah, Brother Charbel learned not only the fundamentals of theology, but above all, the love of the Eucharist, Marian devotion, and an extraordinary fidelity to the monastic vocation. The relationship between these two saints, teacher and disciple, united by the same ideal of holiness, constitutes one of the most beautiful episodes in the history of the Maronite Church. On July 23, 1859, Brother Charbel was ordained a priest in Bukerque, the seat of the Maronite Patriarchate. The ceremony, conducted according to the ancient Syriac Maronite rite, marked the beginning of a new chapter in his path to consecration. As a priest, he returned to the monastery of St. Maron in Anaya, where he would live for the next 16 years in community with his brother monks. During this period, Father Charbel distinguished himself by his scrupulous fidelity to priestly duties, the reverence with which he celebrated the divine mysteries, and his constant readiness to serve his brothers. However, his deepest longing remained for solitude and absolute silence, to completely devote himself to the contemplation of God. Chapter 3. The Eremitical Life. The desire for greater solitude and recollection that burned in Father Charbel's heart finally found fulfillment in 1875, when he received permission from his superiors to retire to the hermitage of Saints Peter and Paul. Situated on a hill a short distance from the monastery of Anaya, this permission wasn't easily granted, as the eremitical life represented a special calling within the already demanding monastic vocation. Only after verifying Father Charbel's spiritual maturity and his ability to face the harsh conditions of the hermitage did the superiors accede to his request, recognizing in it the authentic inspiration of the Holy Spirit. The hermitage of Saints Peter and Paul, built with rough stones and surrounded by lush cedar trees, consisted of only 3 small rooms: a chapel for the celebration of the Divine Liturgy, a room for work and spiritual reading, and a cell for rest. Living conditions were extremely austere, without electricity or heating, exposed to the rigors of the Lebanese winter, with frequent snowfalls and sub-zero temperatures. The furnishings were reduced to the essentials: a simple altar, some liturgical and spiritual books, a hard plank that served as a bed, and the few utensils necessary for manual labor. In this realm of radical poverty, Father Charbel found the ideal space for his incessant search for God. The hermit's daily life followed an immutable rhythm, marked by prayer, manual labor, and ascetic practices. He rose long before dawn to begin his day with long hours of prayer. He celebrated the divine liturgy each day with extraordinary devotion, assisted by another monk who came up from the monastery, as Maronite eremitical tradition doesn't allow a hermit to live in complete solitude. He dedicated a large part of his time to the meditative reading of the sacred scriptures and the fathers of the church, especially the great masters of the Syriac tradition like Saint Ephrem and Saint Isaac of Nineveh. The rest of the day was occupied with agricultural work in the hermitage's small garden and in the creation of liturgical articles. Father Charbel's ascetic practices astonished even his brother monks. Accustomed to a life of austerity, his fasting was almost continuous, subsisting mainly on a mixture of wild herbs. He constantly wore a rough cilice, slept very few hours on the hard ground using a stone as a pillow, and subjected himself to rigorous disciplines. All this not out of contempt for the body, but as an expression of his desire to participate in the sufferings of Christ for the salvation of souls. Despite these mortifications, he maintained a serene and welcoming countenance, reflecting the inner joy that arose from his intimate union with God. For the 23 years he lived in the hermitage, Father Charbel rarely descended to the monastery, except in cases of extreme necessity. However, his presence in the mountains didn't go unnoticed by the inhabitants of the region, who began to come to him seeking advice, spiritual consolation, and prayer for their sick. Although the hermit avoided all prominence, his reputation for holiness spread, attracting people of various religious faiths, including Muslims and Druze. Testimonies from the time recount numerous prodigious events, inexplicable healings, the ability to read hearts, and an extraordinary dominion over nature, such as when he protected the monastery's crops from a plague of locusts through his prayer. Chapter 4. Miracles during his lifetime. Despite his yearning to remain hidden from the world's eyes, God wished to manifest the holiness of his servant through various miracles that occurred during his life. These extraordinary events, attested to by numerous trustworthy witnesses, reveal how divine power acted through this humble monk who had completely dedicated his life to contemplation. The monastery superiors, aware of these events, maintained an attitude of prudent discernment, recognizing in them the authenticity of Father Charbel's spiritual life without falling into a sensationalist pursuit of the marvelous. One of the most talked about miracles occurred during a severe plague of locusts that threatened the crops of the Anaya region. The farmers, desperate at the imminent loss of their harvests, went to the monastery requesting the intercession of the holy hermit. The superior ordered Father Charbel to bless the affected fields. With humble obedience, the hermit descended from his retreat, and after a brief but intense prayer, he took holy water and sprinkled it over the boundaries of the monastery's lands. To everyone's astonishment, the locusts stopped exactly at the lines marked by the holy water, without crossing them, thus preserving the crops of the monks and the farmers who had requested his help. Father Charbel's ability to read hearts and know hidden realities constitutes another aspect of the supernatural gifts that God granted him. Numerous testimonies recount how the hermit revealed to his visitors aspects of their inner lives that he couldn't have known by natural means, or warned them of imminent dangers that were later confirmed. A particularly moving case was that of a mother who ascended to the hermitage to ask for prayers for her son, gravely ill in a distant village. Before she could explain her situation, Father Charbel said to her, "Return to your home. Your son is already healed. At this very moment the fever has left him." The woman, upon returning to her home, verified that the healing had occurred exactly at the moment indicated by the hermit. His dominion over the elements of nature appears in several episodes of the saint's life. During a particularly harsh winter, the monk who assisted Father Charbel in the celebration of the Eucharist observed with astonishment how the oil lamp that illuminated the altar burned with water instead of oil, because the oil had frozen due to the low temperatures. On one occasion, a fierce storm extinguished all the lamps in the hermitage while Saint Charbel was celebrating the divine liturgy. To his assistant's astonishment, the saint's fingertips began to emit a supernatural light, illuminating the altar and allowing him to complete the Eucharistic celebration. These phenomena, similar to those recounted in the lives of great Christian mystics, manifested the hermit's profound union with God, the source of all light. Perhaps the most impressive aspect of the prodigies attributed to Father Charbel during his lifetime was his power of intercession for the sick. People of all religious faiths, including Muslims and Druze, flocked to the hermitage seeking the holy monk's prayers for their loved ones suffering from various ailments. The hermit, always humble and reluctant to attribute any power to himself, simply prayed over the sick or blessed oil that was later applied to the sufferers. Testimonies of cures multiplied, the blind regaining their sight, the paralyzed walking again, terminal illnesses inexplicably disappearing. However, Father Charbel always insisted that it was God who healed through his infinite mercy, and that he was merely an unworthy instrument of divine grace. Chapter 5. The Holy Death Father. Charbel's earthly life came to an end on December 24th, 1898, the eve of the Nativity of our Lord. That morning, while celebrating the divine liturgy in the small chapel of the hermitage, the saint suffered a stroke at the very moment of consecration. Despite the intense pain, he managed to complete the holy sacrifice, demonstrating his extraordinary devotion to the Eucharist until the very last moment. Immediately afterward, he fell into a semi-conscious state. His companion, alarmed, rushed to the monastery for help, and several monks hurried up to the hermitage to assist their revered brother. During the 8 days of his agony, Father Charbel maintained an extraordinary serenity and peace, never complaining of the pain and remaining in constant prayer. The monks who attended him took turns at his side, impressed by the luminosity that seemed to emanate from his face, emaciated by austerity and illness. Aware that his final meeting with the Lord was approaching, the hermit received the last sacraments with indescribable fervor. His last words, spoken with difficulty but with clarity of spirit, were a prayer of complete surrender into God's hands. "Father, into your hands I commend my spirit." The very words Jesus uttered on the cross. News of the holy hermit's agony spread rapidly through the region, and numerous people from the neighboring villages began to ascend to the hermitage to receive his last blessing. Among them were Christians of various denominations, as well as Muslims and Druze, who revered Father Charbel as a man of God. He had a word of comfort, a compassionate look, a silent blessing for everyone. Those present during these last days describe a supernatural atmosphere enveloping the humble cell, as if the veil separating the visible from the invisible had become thinner, allowing a glimpse of the glory toward which the holy monk was heading. Finally, on the night of December 24th, as the monastic community prepared to celebrate the Nativity of our Lord, Father Charbel peacefully surrendered his soul to God. It was the culmination of a life entirely consecrated to the pursuit of the Absolute, a paschal transition that providentially coincided with the eve of the celebration of Christ's birth. The monks, though saddened by the loss of such a revered brother, perceived that it was not a time for mourning, but for spiritual joy. For they were certain that the hermit had attained the beatific vision he had so longed for during his earthly life. Due to a heavy snowfall that made descending the mountain difficult, Father Charbel's body remained in the hermitage for another day. When the monks finally managed to transport it to the monastery, they observed with astonishment that, despite the intense cold, the corpse maintained complete flexibility and a normal body temperature, as if death had not affected his flesh. This phenomenon, described in the lives of numerous saints, was the first of a series of extraordinary signs that would accompany the hermit's body after his death. The funeral, celebrated with the solemnity of the Maronite rite, brought together a multitude who wanted to pay homage to the one who had lived and died in the obscurity of the hermitage, but whose spiritual light could not remain hidden. Chapter 6. Post-mortem phenomena. According to monastic custom, Father Charbel's body was buried without a coffin in the monastery's communal tomb, located in the cemetery adjacent to the church. However, a few days after the burial, the inhabitants of the neighboring villages began to report a strange phenomenon. An intense light shone over the hermit's tomb at night, visible from a great distance. This prodigy, attested to by numerous witnesses of various religious faiths, including skeptics who had come expressly to verify the truth of the accounts, continued for 45 consecutive nights. The superiors of the monastery, initially cautious about these reports, eventually acknowledged the reality of the phenomenon after verifying it personally. 4 months after his death, another extraordinary event came to confirm Father Charbel's sanctity. An oily liquid with healing properties began to emanate from the tomb, soaking the surrounding earth. This phenomenon, unusual even in hagiographic annals, attracted the attention of ecclesiastical authorities, who decided to open the grave to investigate its origin. On April 15, 1899, in the presence of doctors, Ottoman government officials, and numerous witnesses, the exhumation of the body was carried out. To everyone's amazement, the hermit's corpse was perfectly preserved, flexible, and appearing simply to be asleep, despite having been in direct contact with the damp earth. From his right side flowed the mysterious liquid that had soaked his clothes and the floor of the tomb. Following this discovery, the body was placed in a wooden coffin and moved to a special room in the monastery. The doctors who examined the corpse certified that no embalming methods had been used and that the incorruption could not be explained by natural causes. The miraculous flow of oil continued, requiring that Father Charbel's monastic robes be changed periodically due to the constant dampness. This liquid, reverently collected by the monks, began to be distributed among the faithful, who requested it to anoint their sick, and soon, inexplicable medical cures began to be reported. In 1927, almost 30 years after the hermit's death, a second official exhumation was performed, in the presence of the commission appointed for the beatification process, which had already begun. Again, the incorruption of the body and the continuation of the oily secretion were confirmed. On this occasion, official photographs were taken, and more exhaustive medical examinations were carried out, confirming the absence of any scientific explanation for the phenomenon. The body, placed in a new coffin, was deposited in a special tomb built into the wall of the monastic church, where the faithful could visit and pray before it. What is most astonishing about these post-mortem phenomena is their persistence over time. Even today, more than a century after the saint's death, the body continues to maintain a strange flexibility. Although it has experienced some natural darkening, the oily secretion, although with less intensity, continues to occur. and the monastery of Anaya continues to distribute small cotton balls soaked in this liquid to the thousands of pilgrims who come annually to the sanctuary. Testimonies of cures and other favors obtained through this form of relic have multiplied over the decades, contributing to the hermit of Lebanon's worldwide reputation for holiness and confirming the divine intervention that wished to glorify his faithful servant in such an extraordinary way. Chapter 7. Miracles and Canonization. Father Charbel's reputation for holiness, already considerable during his lifetime, spread exponentially after his death, thanks to the extraordinary phenomena that occurred at his tomb and the numerous miracles attributed to his intercession. People of all religious denominations, not only Maronite Christians, but also Orthodox, Protestants, Muslims, and Druze, flocked to the monastery of Anaya to pray before his mortal remains and to seek his help in various needs. The monastery's records began to fill with testimonies of graces received, many of them clearly miraculous, defying any natural or medical explanation. Among the countless documented miracles, the case of the Maronite nun's sister, Mary Abel Camary, stands out for its importance to the canonization process. This nun, who suffered from a strangulated double hernia complicated by a gastric ulcer, had been declared inoperable by several doctors due to her serious overall condition. On the night of January 12, 1950, Sister Mary was taken to the hospital, where doctors confirmed that her death was imminent. The nun then asked for a cotton ball soaked in the liquid emanating from Father Charbel's body. After applying it to her abdomen while praying fervently, she experienced a sudden and complete recovery. The doctors, amazed, found that both the hernia and the ulcer had disappeared without a trace, a scientifically inexplicable fact that was meticulously investigated and documented by the Vatican Medical Commission. Another extraordinary case was that of Nohad El-Shami, a Lebanese woman who in 1993 suffered hemiplegia caused by a stroke, completely paralyzed on her left side and with serious speech difficulties. Doctors told her that her condition would be permanent. On the night of January 22, 1993, Nohad had a vision in which two Maronite monks, whom she identified as Father Charbel and another monk, approached her bed. The holy hermit performed a mystical surgical intervention on her neck and said, "I have come to operate on you through the intercession of Our Lady of Lebanon, whom you have visited twice. I want you to go to the monastery on my feast day and give testimony of your healing before my brother monks." The next morning, Nohad awoke completely healed, to the astonishment of her family and the doctors attending her. This miracle, which occurred almost a century after the saint's death, demonstrates the continuity of his powerful intercession. The canonization process of Father Charbel followed the rigorous procedures established by the Catholic Church. In 1925, the cause was officially initiated at the diocesan level, collecting testimonies from people who had known the hermit or who had received graces through his intercession. In 1954, Pope Pius XIII declared Father Charbel venerable, officially recognizing the heroism of his virtues. On December 5, 1965, during the Second Vatican Council, Pope Paul VI beatified him, raising him to the altars as blessed. This ceremony had special significance because for the first time in modern history, a son of the Maronite Church was beatified, representing a recognition of the holiness that flourished in the ancient Eastern churches and communion with Rome. Finally, on October 9, 1977, Pope Paul VI canonized Father Charbel, proclaiming him a saint of the Universal Church. The ceremony, held in St. Peter's Square before a multitude of pilgrims who had come especially from Lebanon, was a moment of great joy for the Maronite Church and for the entire Lebanese people, who were then suffering the beginnings of a devastating civil war. In his homily, The Pope highlighted how the figure of the new saint represented a bond of union between East and West, a testimony of holiness that transcended denominational divisions and a sign of hope for the tormented Middle East. Saint Charbel thus became the first Lebanese saint of modern times, paving the way for the later canonization of other sons and daughters of the land of cedars. Chapter 8. Spirituality and Message. The life and spiritual legacy of Saint Charbel are fully integrated into the rich tradition of Eastern monasticism, with its roots in the deserts of Egypt and Syria. This spiritual current, which has nourished the Church since the early centuries of Christianity, is characterized by its emphasis on the search for God through silence, austerity, and continuous prayer. The holy hermit of Lebanon perfectly embodies these ideals, taking them to their most radical expression in his eremitic life. However, his example is not limited to monks or consecrated persons, but offers valuable elements for every Christian seeking a deeper relationship with God in the midst of the contemporary world. The centrality of the Eucharist is one of the fundamental aspects of Saint Charbel's spirituality. For the holy hermit, the daily celebration of the divine liturgy represented the high point of his day, the source and center of his entire spiritual life. Witnesses recount the extraordinary devotion with which he celebrated the holy sacrifice, often prolonging it for hours in profound recollection. His death, occurring precisely during the consecration, symbolically underscores this Eucharistic dimension of his spirituality. In a world where haste and superficiality threaten even the experience of the sacred, Saint Charbel invites us to rediscover the immense value of the Eucharist as the true presence of Christ among us, and indispensable nourishment for the spiritual journey. Contemplative silence represents another essential element of the Lebanese saint's spiritual message. In his hermitage, far from the world's clamor, Charbel found the space conducive to hearing God's voice in the depths of his heart. This silence was not a mere absence of noise, but an inner attitude of receptivity and openness to the divine mystery. Through long hours of meditation on the Holy Scriptures and personal prayer, the hermit established an intimate and continuous dialogue with the Lord. For contemporary man, immersed in a culture of noise and constant distraction, Saint Charbel's testimony constitutes an urgent invitation to rediscover the value of silence as a necessary condition for an authentic spiritual life. To hear the voice of God speaking in the secret of the heart. The rigorous asceticism practiced by Saint Charbel manifested in his extreme austerity of life, continuous fasting, and various bodily mortifications might at first glance seem distant from contemporary sensibilities. However, stripped of its most severe elements, it contains a message of enduring relevance, the need for self-mastery, sobriety, and detachment from the superfluous to achieve true inner freedom. In a society characterized by consumerism and the unbridled pursuit of immediate pleasure, the example of the holy hermit reminds us that true happiness is not found in the multiplication of material goods or sensory experiences, but in the progressive liberation from the enslavements that prevent us from fully loving God and neighbor. The profound humility of Saint Charbel, his constant avoidance of any form of recognition or admiration, constitutes perhaps the most countercultural aspect of his message for our time. In an era dominated by the cult of image and the obsession with visibility on social media, the hermit who refused even to be photographed and who constantly sought the last place represents a powerful antidote to contemporary vanity and narcissism. His life teaches us that true greatness in God's eyes is found precisely in self-forgetfulness, in renouncing all pretensions to prominence, and in silent and selfless service. The gospel paradox, whoever humbles himself will be exalted, finds in the figure of this monk, hidden in life and glorified after his death, an eloquent confirmation. Finally, A particularly significant aspect of St. Charbel's spiritual legacy is his ability to transcend confessional boundaries and become a meeting point for people of different religious traditions. In present-day Lebanon, where Christians of various denominations live alongside Muslims and Druze, the sanctuary of Anaya daily receives pilgrims from all these faiths, united in their veneration of the Holy Hermit and in their seeking of his powerful intercession. This phenomenon, exceptional in a Middle East frequently torn by sectarian conflicts, shows how authentic holiness possesses a universal language that speaks to the heart of every human being, beyond their cultural or religious particularities, and constitutes a sign of hope for interreligious dialogue and the building of peace. Chapter 9. Miracles and Contemporary Testimonies. The stream of miracles and extraordinary graces attributed to the intercession of Saint Charbel has not ceased with his canonization, but continues to flow abundantly to this day. The monastery of Anaya receives annually more than 4 million pilgrims from all over the world and of diverse religious confessions, many of whom come to give thanks for favors received or to implore the saint's help in desperate situations. The monastery's archives contain thousands of documented testimonies of healings and other prodigies, many of them accompanied by medical certifications that confirm their inexplicable nature from a scientific point of view. One of the most impressive phenomena of recent decades is the appearance of images of St. Charbel in photographs where he was not originally present. The best-known case is that of Raymond Nader, a Lebanese engineer who in 1994 visited the monastery of Anaya and took a photograph in front of the saint's tomb. When the film was developed, a luminous figure in a monastic habit appeared beside him, which everyone identified as Saint Charbel. This phenomenon was repeated on several subsequent occasions, always in photographs taken in Anaya. Teams of photography experts, including technicians from the Kodak company, examined the negatives and ruled out any manipulation or photographic trickery. Similar cases have been reported in various parts of the world, especially among the Lebanese diaspora, contributing to the international spread of devotion to the Holy Hermit. Miraculous healings remain the most frequent type of grace attributed to the intercession of Saint Charbel. Many of them occur after the application of blessed oil that has been in contact with the saint's relics, following a tradition that dates back to the first years after his death. Among the numerous recent cases, the case of Daphne Gutierrez stands out, a woman from Arizona, United States, who in 2016 miraculously regained her sight after having been declared irremediably blind due to ischemic optic neuropathy. After attending a novena in honor of Saint Charbel and being anointed with oil, blessed with his relics, Daphne woke up one morning with her vision completely restored, to the astonishment of the doctors who had treated her and who certified the medical inexplicability of her healing. Another noteworthy aspect of contemporary testimonies is the frequency with which apparitions or direct interventions of the saint are reported. Numerous people claim to have seen St. Charbel at their bedside during serious illnesses or moments of crisis, describing him exactly as he appears in the few images that remain of him, despite not having seen them previously. Others recount vivid dreams in which the hermit communicates specific messages or indicates treatments for their ailments. The consistency of these accounts, coming from people of different countries, cultures, and educational levels, with no prior connection between them, is particularly significant. It suggests an active presence of the saint that transcends the usual categories of intercession. The publication of these testimonies in books, magazines, and more recently on websites and social media has contributed to the global expansion of devotion to Saint Charbel. Each new documented miracle draws more people to this luminous figure of Eastern sanctity, confirming the providential role that the humble Lebanese hermit continues to play in the church and in the contemporary world. Unlike other saints, whose veneration diminishes over time, Devotion to Saint Charbel seems to intensify and spread ever wider, as if his spiritual mission, far from concluding with his death over a century ago, is now reaching its full development on a universal scale. Chapter 10. Global Devotion. The veneration of Saint Charbel, initially confined to his native Lebanon and Lebanese diaspora communities, has experienced a truly global expansion in recent decades, becoming a spiritual phenomenon that transcends geographical, cultural, and even confessional boundaries. This internationalization of his cult is particularly noteworthy considering that he is an Eastern saint, belonging to a particular church, the Maronite, relatively small in the global Catholic context, and whose life was lived in complete anonymity, far from any historical or social prominence. In Latin America, devotion to Saint Charbel has taken root with extraordinary strength, especially in Mexico, where he is considered one of the most miraculous and venerated saints. The first image of the saint arrived in this country in 1950, brought by Lebanese immigrants, but his cult quickly spread among the local population after numerous testimonies of favors and cures. Currently, there are over 400 temples in Mexico with chapels or altars dedicated to Saint Charbel, and hundreds of thousands of faithful participate in novenas and celebrations in his honor. Similar phenomena are observed in other Latin American countries such as Colombia, Venezuela, and Argentina, where the devotion to the Lebanese hermit has found fertile ground in popular religiosity, traditionally receptive to supernatural manifestations and miracle-working saints. In the United States and Canada, devotion to Saint Charbel has spread from Lebanese and Middle Eastern communities to the Catholic population in general. Numerous parishes have incorporated images of the saint and celebrate his feast annually, while Maronite spirituality centers like the St. Charbel National Shrine in Phoenix, Arizona, attract pilgrims of diverse ethnic origins. The figure of the Lebanese hermit is particularly appealing in a society characterized by materialism and activism, offering a counterpoint of silence, interiority, and detachment. His message of radical surrender to God in solitude paradoxically resonates in large North American cities, where many seek an antidote to the superficiality and spiritual emptiness of the dominant culture. Western Europe, despite its growing secularization, has also seen the devotion to the Lebanese saint flourish. France, which maintains historical ties with Lebanon, has several important centers of Saint Charbel's cult, such as the Maronite Chapel of Notre-Dame du Liban in Paris. In Italy, in addition to its presence in Maronite churches, several Latin Rite parishes have incorporated images and relics of the saint, especially after miraculous cures attributed to his intercession. Spain, Portugal, and Belgium have also experienced a remarkable growth in this devotion, fostered by the pastoral work of Maronite priests and the dissemination of testimonies of graces received through publications and digital media. The expansion of devotion to Saint Charbel has also reached regions geographically and culturally further removed from his Lebanese roots. In Australia, a country with a significant Lebanese community, there are several shrines dedicated to the hermit, attracting not only Middle Eastern faithful, but also Australians of diverse backgrounds. In the Philippines, a deeply Catholic nation in Southeast Asia, devotion to the Lebanese saint has developed remarkably in recent decades, with chapels dedicated to him in several major cities. Even in African countries such as Nigeria and Ivory Coast, a growing cult of Saint Charbel is reported, often introduced by Lebanese missionaries or local faithful who have experienced his miraculous intercession. Chapter 11. A Prayer to Saint Charbel. Glorious Saint Charbel, monk and hermit of Lebanon, you who abandoned the world and its pleasures to live in solitude and total surrender to God, turn your compassionate gaze upon me today as I confidently come to your powerful intercession. You who in life sought concealment and silence, now shine as a luminous star in the church of God, manifesting the glory that the Lord reserves for those who love him with an undivided heart. In the humble hermitage of Anaya, far from the world's clamor, you found the hidden treasure of the kingdom and sold all to acquire it. Your life, consecrated to continuous prayer and sacrifice, teaches us that only in God does the human heart find its true rest. Help me to understand, as you did, that nothing in this world can compare to the loving knowledge of Christ Jesus, and that all things are rubbish compared to the sweetness of his presence. That, following your example, I may learn to value silence and inner solitude where God speaks to the heart. Saint of miracles, whose incorrupt body continues to manifest the power of God, I come to you in my present need. You who during your earthly life relieved so many sufferings, and who after your death have multiplied the prodigios of your intercession, hear my plea with the same compassion you showed to all the afflicted who came to your hermitage. I present to you especially this need that afflicts me. The petition is made. I trust that if it is for the greater glory of God and the good of my soul, you will obtain for me this grace that I so long for. Maronite monk, faithful son of the Antiochian Church, you who celebrated the divine liturgy with extraordinary devotion and who breathed your last during the Eucharistic consecration, teach me to value the immense treasure of the Eucharist and to participate in it with the same ardent faith that animated you. May I, like you, find in the bread of life the strength to persevere on the path of holiness, despite difficulties and temptations. Help me to understand that each communion is a real encounter with Christ, who gives himself for us and invites us to give ourselves with him to the Father. Universal saint, venerated not only by Christians, but also by followers of other religions. Teach us the way of peace and brotherhood. In a world torn apart by conflict and division, be you an instrument of reconciliation and concord, especially in your beloved Lebanon and throughout the Middle East. May your intercession obtain for all peoples the precious gift of peace, founded on justice and mutual respect. May the persecuted Christians in so many regions of the world find in you a powerful protector who helps them persevere in faith despite trials. Finally, Saint Charbel, model of monastic virtues, intercede for me so that, at the end of my earthly pilgrimage, I may stand before the throne of God with hands full of good works. May your protection accompany me each day, turning me away from sin and guiding me on the path of holiness. And when the time comes for my departure from this world, assist me with your presence, as you have done with so many of your devotees, so that I may confidently abandon myself into the merciful hands of the Father, united to Christ for all eternity. Amen.